The rain had been falling since before dusk, a cold, steady rain that soaked into the earth and turned the yard of Caleb Hart's ranch into a slick of mud and regret, the kind of rain that reminded a man of every poor decision he'd ever made. And Caleb stood at the doorway of his house, with his jaw clenched and his shoulders stiff, as if he could hold the whole night back by force alone. The lamplight behind him spilling onto the porch, where the woman stood, with her hands folded tight at her waist, and a small boy half hidden behind her skirt, her voice barely rising above the drumming rain when she said, "I can sleep in the barn," like it was nothing. Like it didn't matter that the barn was little more than 4 walls and a leaking roof. Like it didn't matter that wolves had been heard in the hills again, or that the wind cut through the slats like a blade, and Caleb hated himself a little for the way that sentence landed in his chest, sharp and unwanted, because he had already decided, had decided weeks ago, when he sent the letter back east and sealed his fate with ink and stubborn pride, that this arrangement would be clean, distant, controlled. No emotions, no softness, no space for mercy to grow roots where it didn't belong. She was supposed to arrive with confidence, with a clear understanding of the bargain, not standing here soaked to the bone, her hair darkened by rain, her dress clinging to her like it had known better days and lost them, her eyes steady but tired in a way that told a story she wasn't speaking aloud. And the boy, God, the boy, couldn't have been more than 5 or 6, his boots worn thin, his curls plastered to his forehead, staring at Caleb not with fear, but with a careful measuring look, as if he had learned early that grown men could decide whether you slept warm or cold with a single word. "No," Caleb said, the word coming out harder than he meant it to, and he reached back and pulled the door shut, not slamming it but closing it firmly, the sound of the latch clicking into place echoing louder in his ears than the thunder rolling over the plains, and for a moment he stood there with his back to the door, breathing through his nose, telling himself that this was necessary, that letting her inside would complicate things, that kindness was a luxury he could not afford, not after the winter he'd survived, not after the woman he'd buried on this land 5 years ago, not after he'd learned the hard way that opening your door could ruin you. Outside, the woman didn't knock again, and that silence felt worse than shouting would have, because it meant she had accepted his answer. And somehow that cut deeper than resistance, and Caleb found himself pacing the small room, his boots thudding against the wooden floor, his mind dragging him backward whether he wanted it to or not, back to the letter he'd received months earlier, neatly folded, smelling faintly of soap and desperation, the handwriting careful, respectful, explaining that her name was Eleanor Price, that her husband had died of fever on the journey west, that she had a child to care for and no family left willing to take her in, that she was strong and willing to work and understood the arrangement for what it was. A marriage of need, not romance, a roof in exchange for loyalty and labor, and Caleb had read that letter 3 times before burning it in the stove, telling himself he didn't need to remember the words, that he only needed the outcome, and yet here she was, flesh and bone and rain-soaked reality, standing on his porch with nowhere to go because the stagecoach had left her at the crossroads and ridden on, because the town was 10 miles back and the boarding house full, because the world was not kind to women who traveled alone with children, especially not women who arrived with no ring on their finger and a marriage promised but not yet sealed. Inside the house, the clock ticked, loud and slow, each second stretching, and Caleb poured himself a cup of coffee, though he didn't want it, his hands shaking just enough to spill a few drops on the table, and he cursed under his breath because he hadn't planned for this feeling, this pressure behind his ribs, this sense that he had already failed some unseen test. And he told himself again that it was safer this way, that the barn was dry enough, that the animals would keep them warm, that Eleanor was not his responsibility yet, not truly, not until morning when they could speak like adults in daylight and draw clear lines. But another part of him, quieter and far more dangerous, remembered nights when he had begged the sky for mercy and received none, remembered how it felt to be turned away, to be told no, when yes would have cost someone almost nothing, and that part of him would not shut up. Outside, Eleanor guided the boy down the porch steps, her hand firm but gentle on his shoulder, and she didn't look back at the door, not once, because she knew better than to beg a second time, because pride was the last thing she owned outright. And as they crossed the yard toward the barn, mud sucking at their boots, she whispered reassurances to the child, telling him they would be fine, that she had slept in worse places. That morning would come quickly, and the boy nodded, trusting her with the blind faith only children had left, though his eyes kept flicking back toward the house, with its glowing windows and promise of warmth. And Eleanor felt something twist inside her then, not anger, not even sorrow, but a hard resolve, because she had not come this far to be broken by one man's closed door. And if this was the price of survival, she would pay it without complaint. The barn loomed dark and quiet, the smell of hay and animals thick in the air, and Eleanor settled the boy in a stall lined with straw, wrapping him in the spare shawl she carried, rubbing his hands until warmth returned. And as he drifted into sleep, she sat with her back against the wall, listening to the rain hammer the roof, her thoughts sharp and clear despite her exhaustion, telling herself that this marriage would not be what she had imagined in softer moments, telling herself that Caleb Hart was a hard man because the world had made him so, and that hardness could be endured if it meant safety in the long run. But somewhere in the distance, closer than she expected, a door creaked open, and Eleanor did not hear it, but the barn animals did, lifting their heads as footsteps crossed the yard. And Caleb stood in the rain again, coat pulled tight, lantern in hand, staring at the barn with a look on his face that had nothing to do with anger anymore, and everything to do with a decision he had sworn never to make again, because he realized, too late, or maybe just in time, that locking the door had not locked his conscience, and whatever happened next would change all of their lives in ways none of them yet understood. Caleb did not knock on the barn door because he did not want to announce himself, not yet, not while his thoughts were still a tangled mess of guilt, pride, and something dangerously close to fear. And as he pushed the door open slowly, the lantern light spilled across the straw-lined floor and settled on Eleanor, sitting upright against the wooden wall, her back straight despite the exhaustion in her eyes, her arms wrapped protectively around the sleeping boy, and for a long moment, they simply looked at each other, the rain rattling the roof above them and the animals shifting softly in their stalls like quiet witnesses, to a moment neither of them had expected. "You shouldn't be here," Eleanor said finally, not accusing, not pleading, just stating a fact, because she had already prepared herself for the night as it was. And Caleb swallowed hard, realizing that what hurt most was not her words but the absence of hope in them, the way she had already accepted that he was not the kind of man who came back to fix his mistakes, and that realization cut deeper than any anger could have, because it forced him to confront the truth he had been avoiding, that he had used rules and distance as armor, and in doing so he had almost become the very cruelty he despised. "The house is warm," he said gruffly, as if warmth were a simple, practical thing, and not a doorway to everything he feared losing control over. "And the boy shouldn't sleep out here." And Eleanor hesitated, not because she didn't want to go, but because she had learned through loss that sudden kindness often came with strings, and she needed to know the cost before she accepted it. "I won't cause trouble," she said quietly. "I'll work. I'll stay out of your way. I just need a place where my child can be safe." And Caleb nodded once, sharply, because that was the part he could agree to without hesitation, safety, and he turned away, already heading back toward the house, trusting her to follow or not, because for the first time that night he understood that trust, once broken, could not be demanded, only offered. The walk back felt longer than before, the rain colder, the yard heavier. But when Eleanor stepped inside the house, the warmth wrapped around her like a memory she hadn't allowed herself to touch in years, and the boy stirred in her arms, murmuring in his sleep, his face relaxing as if his body knew before his mind did that the danger had passed. And Caleb stood awkwardly to one side, pointing out a small room near the kitchen, explaining in clipped sentences where blankets were kept, where water could be drawn, what time he rose in the morning, laying out rules like fence posts, straight and firm, because rules were easier than emotions. And Eleanor listened carefully, nodding, grateful but not fooled, because she could hear the strain beneath his words, the effort it took him to be decent, and she respected him for it more than she would have respected easy charm. Morning came quietly, the storm having washed the sky clean, and sunlight crept across the fields as if nothing had happened, as if doors had not been closed and reopened, as if trust had not been tested and tentatively restored. And Caleb watched from the window as Eleanor moved through the yard with practiced efficiency, helping with chores without being asked, her movements confident, capable. And he realized then that she was not a burden he had taken on out of obligation, but a partner forged by necessity and strength, someone who understood survival not as an abstract idea, but as a daily discipline. And over the weeks that followed, something shifted in the house. Slowly and without announcement, meals grew quieter but fuller. Laughter, soft and surprised, found its way back into corners where silence had ruled. The boy learned the land as if it were part of him, chasing chickens, asking questions, calling Caleb sir at first, and then, one evening without realizing it, calling him Pa, a word that landed like thunder and left Caleb standing frozen in the doorway with tears he did not wipe away. Eleanor never brought up that first night, never reminded him of the locked door or the barn, because she understood that shame could only heal if it was allowed to fade into action, and Caleb proved himself not with grand apologies, but with constancy, with early mornings and shared burdens, with the quiet way he stood between his family and the hard edges of the world when it mattered most. And in time, the marriage that had begun as a contract became something sturdier, something chosen again and again, not because it was easy, but because it was right years later. When travelers stopped at the Hart Ranch and asked about the story of the mail-order bride and the man who had once said no, Caleb would smile faintly and say only that the hardest doors to open were the ones inside ourselves, and Eleanor would squeeze his hand, knowing that sometimes a single moment of compassion could rewrite a lifetime of regret. And if this story touched your heart, if it reminded you that kindness delayed is not kindness denied, then don't forget to subscribe to the channel.